Hi and welcome back to the channel, and what we're going to look at today is an overview, a timeline of the various drive solutions that were released for the Apple II series. Now, it's not going to be exhaustive. I'm not going to talk about every single device that was ever released for the Apple II. The aim here, for me at least, is to give you a reasonable overview of the different devices that were released in pretty much I think it was about 11 to 12 year period from the launch of the Apple II in 1977 all the way through to 1989 when the last basic computer came out, the Apple IIc Plus. Now, I personally got into the Apple II about 6 years ago. I was watching retro channels and I saw the Apple II and I thought that was an interesting machine, a machine that I never actually encountered over here in the UK. I know it was actually very common over in the US because of its use in many educational programs over there. And it was also used a great deal, I think, as a business computer, at least in the late 70s and early 80s. But over here in the UK, it's actually extremely rare. And many of my devices, drives and things like that have actually been imported from the US. So for instance, here I have a Disk II drive. This comes from the Disk II system, which consists of this drive, a card that plugs in the machine, what that then allows you to plug it into. And it also came with Apple DOS, which was a new DOS that Apple released specifically to allow you to use this disk drive. Later on in the history of the machine, you have the UniDisk, which has its own card. And then you have other drives, 3.5-inch drives, some of which look identical to each other, but in fact, they're actually different drives. So I find that as you get to the middle of the 80s in particular, it actually becomes quite confusing exactly what's going on with all the different storage solutions. And, you know, I'm not just talking about disk drives, I'm also talking about hard drives as well. How do they work? How does the Apple II interface with a hard drive? So what I'm hoping to do here is give you that quick overview. And then in other videos, we're going to look at the Disk II drive, and we're going to look at the UniDisk drive and an operating system that came out later in the 80s, which was called ProDOS. And then in another video, we're going to actually look at hard disks and how you can actually get hard disk, or at least hard disk-like solutions working with your Apple II today. Anyway, we have quite a lot to go through, so let's make a start on our overview of the Apple II and its storage solutions. But before we do that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay, where you can make your tech dreams a reality. And now in PCBWay's Project Share, you can upload your projects and share them with the community. And if you do use any of these projects, a percentage of the money that you pay will actually go to the author. So you can share your projects and you can also benefit the projects that others have shared on PCBWay. So if you do have any projects, why not upload them to PCBWay and get them out to the community? And of course, why don't you browse the Project Share and see if there's something there that's interesting for you? Because whether it's PCB prototyping, PCB assembly, 3D printing, or even CNC machining, PCBWay is the way. Starting with an instant quote for your PCB projects, PCBWay will leap into action, building your PCB, assembling it for you if you wish, and once it's passed their quality tests, it'll be winging its way to you in a flash. PCBWay, PCB prototyping the easy way. So here's our timeline, and as you can see, it runs from 1977 all the way through to 1989, basically the last 3 years of the 70s and most of the 1980s, but not all of it. And the reason why I haven't gone all the way through to 1997, which is the last sort of hurrah for the Apple II, and that was when the Apple IIe card eventually was taken off the market. This particular video, we're focusing on the storage methods that we have for the Apple II. So I didn't want to, extend the timeline into a period where there weren't any further storage solutions released. So let's zoom in a little bit and let's go to 1977. And of course, this is the big year, the year when the Apple II was actually launched onto the market. And when it was launched, the only viable way really of getting data into and out of your Apple II was to actually store them onto tapes. So a very standard thing would have been to get yourself a tape deck and then some audio tapes, and then obviously save your basic programs and load them from tape. Commercial software was obviously available in this way. You would buy a box, and inside the box you would have some audio tapes, and then you would load your software from there. But it's a pretty suboptimal solution, really, and there are a number of reasons for it. For example, there was no standard tape drive, and this was very common on a number of micros. For instance, on my Dragon 32, I had the tape drive that we had at home, and depending on the household, the quality of that tape drive could be of variable condition. The tape drive could have been used a lot. It could have been dirty. The tapes themselves can stretch as well, and that can cause the audio to become malformed, and then the data doesn't load incorrectly. There's just so many different reasons why a tape storage system isn't ideal. But anyway, that's the way the Apple II launched, and it's the way people managed to get data into and out of their machine, at least for the first year. And the next big event for us is just 1 year later, and that is with the introduction of the Disk II system. It was a work of genius, really, by Steve Wozniak, and it was a very much needed peripheral for the Apple II computer. Released just a single year after the original machine actually hit the market, and it consisted of a disk drive with a controller card which went into your Apple II, and that would then enable the disk drive. But on top of that, Apple also had to hire in an external company to create a DOS for that particular disk drive, and they marketed that as Apple DOS. So the Disk II system, including Apple DOS, I think is really one of the standout features of the early days of the Apple II. It had a dramatic effect on the take-up of the machine in business, because now you could actually get data off a reliable media, access it randomly, not relying on the serial nature of a tape drive, and it definitely cemented the Apple's place in the business market. Another thing that it did was it allowed video game developers to be much more ambitious about what they were going to do. It took a while for this to actually kick in, but I think some of the standout video games of the early days of microcomputing definitely originated on the Apple II, and you can put that down to the Disk II system and Apple DOS. So definitely a big hit and a massive money spinner as well for Apple. Now, Apple DOS was a pretty capable DOS for its time, but over time it started to show certain limitations. For instance, it only supported a flat hierarchy. In other words, there were no such things as folders where you could store items and, make complex hierarchies to represent, your organization and things like that. And the other thing it didn't support was it was basically limited to producing volumes of a fixed size. At first, that was, I think it was 113 point something kilobytes. And a couple of years later, that was extended to 140 kilobytes. But it didn't really have anything in its design beyond that limit, and pretty soon that turned out to be a limitation. So the next couple of events, they're not really disk releases. They're important because we need to understand the basic timeline and the motivations that led to certain things being developed later. So in the middle of 1979, Apple released the Apple II Plus, and there were no new disk provisions for that, which wasn't an issue because you could carry on using the Disk II system. The Apple II Plus did actually get the benefit of having auto boot, which was a feature which was initially not actually built into the Disk II system. So that was one benefit, I guess. Yeah, apart from that, there weren't that many changes really with the Apple II Plus. Then, just before the end of the decade, in late 1979, the Corvus 11A hard disk was released for the Apple II. You can see here that it's an absolute unit of a drive. It's absolutely huge, isn't it? And I'll show you some other pictures here so you can get an idea of just exactly how gigantic this thing is. And what I found remarkable about it was that the power supply for it is actually as large as the drive pretty much. But that aside, you've got to look back to the context of the time. Hard disks were really something that came from mini computing. In that industry, very large devices were still perfectly normal. The technology was not really microcomputer based. So yeah, very large pieces of equipment was perfectly acceptable. It must have been very exciting to see this hard drive arrive for the microcomputing market. This drive wasn't only for the Apple II, it was actually released for a bunch of different machines. For example, it was released for the S100 bus machines, which included the Altair 8080. Only 10 megabytes in size. But to put that into context, I believe it was something like 80 floppy disks worth of data. So, if you can imagine swapping in and out 80 floppy disks, that just wouldn't be practical. But with this device, you could actually have a really sizable database for the time. So yeah, pretty exciting. Unfortunately, very, very expensive. I think it was something like $5,000. So yeah, not exactly something for a small business, something for a slightly larger organization that had the need of that much data. Now, I'm not going to go on to show you other hard disk solutions because there were actually other solutions that came out in the years that followed. What I really wanted to impress upon you here is that a hard disk solution was actually available for the Apple II as early as 1979. And this obviously had some impact on the people over at Apple because they realized that maybe Apple DOS wasn't really going to stand the test of time in terms of use because it already didn't really work very well on a hard disk. So yeah, let's bear that in mind for the future. Then if we move on a little bit further, we have quite a momentous release. And this was in late 1981, so we're into the 80s at this point. And that is the launch of the Apple III computer. Now, originally, it was envisaged as being the replacement for the Apple II. You can tell that by the name, obviously. And Apple were all in on this particular project. The idea was that within about 6 months of the Apple III being released, the Apple II would be completely redundant and they could basically twilight the Apple II computer system. Along with the Apple III, they designed a new operating system called the Sophisticated Operating System, aka SOS, which is a funny name, I think, for an operating system. But the way people actually pronounced it at the time was applesauce. So yeah, going along with the Apple theme. A much more capable operating system than Apple DOS. It did have the provision of hierarchical folders, and it could also handle volumes much larger than just, say, 140K. So basically, an operating system that could allow the use of a hard disk. Now, we just talked about the Corvus IIe. The IIe had to basically hack Apple DOS for it to run on the Apple II. Now, if it were to be released on the Apple III, that wouldn't be an issue because the Apple III applesauce OS could actually handle that. So this is important. Bear in mind this Apple SOS, applesauce operating system, and we'll find that it crops up a little bit later in our timeline. So next we have to skip ahead a couple of years to 1983. So it appears really that there wasn't really much going on in the Apple II ecosystem, but in fact a lot of things had actually gone on under the water. And the reason for this was, number one, was that the Apple III turned out to be a dud. It was launched with major reliability problems, very, very expensive machine, and it just didn't take off in the way that Apple expected it to. And the reality was that during this period between 1981 and 1983, the vast majority of the company's profits were actually made from the Apple II. It was still the cash cow of the company. It was its lifeblood. And so I think over time there was a bit of a reevaluation between 1981 and 83, and Apple decided that they had to go ahead and produce some enhancements to the machine. So they produced what was mainly a cost-reduced machine, the Apple IIe, but it did have some enhancements in it. So, you know, more memory and certain niceties that you had to pay for with the Apple II Plus were there as standard. Now, during this time, they also realized that the aging Apple DOS wasn't really going to hack it. So they took the applesauce operating system and they forked it and developed a new disk operating system for the Apple II that was going to be called ProDOS. So in around November of 1983, there was a big release for the Apple II, ProDOS, as we just mentioned. And ProDOS, as I said, was a development of applesauce. I think under the hood, it was largely the same operating system, but obviously changes had to be made to make it to work on the Apple II and on the Disk II system. At the same time as this, they now had a disk operating system that could take advantage of hard disks. So Apple actually released their own hard disk at the same time in this year called the ProFile system. This was a 5 megabyte drive, cheaper than the Corvus drive, which to be honest wasn't that difficult. But yeah, 5 megabytes, a little bit cheaper, and it was an official Apple product, so I can imagine that this sold pretty well. Now originally this unit was developed for the Apple IIe, but pretty much like the Apple III, the Apple IIe also didn't sell very well. So it was a good idea to then redevelop it for the Apple II. And with the introduction of ProDOS, they finally had a disk operating system that would work well with hard drives. Now, what does ProDOS offer? Well, let's say the headline features are that it has folders, so you can have a hierarchy of organization inside your floppy disks and your hard disks. And it's actually really important to say that it was completely compatible with the existing Disk II line. So you didn't have to buy any new hardware to use this operating system. You just formatted a disk with ProDOS and off you go. It would work with your existing Disk II system. So yeah, in that way, it was a bit of a no-brainer to upgrade to ProDOS. The other thing that it offers is volumes which can be larger than 140 kilobytes. So the hard limit with ProDOS, as far as I understand it, is 32 megabytes per volume. But of course, you could have multiple volumes attached to your machine using different interface cards. So yeah, a massive increase in data overhead that you could actually grow into. As I said, the profile only at first managed to pack in 5 megabytes of storage. So at the time, 32 megabytes would have seemed like an absolutely massive number. So moving on, and in May of 1984, Apple made quite a big departure and for the first time actually changed the form factor of the Apple II design. The Apple IIe was definitely something of an evolution, taking the case of the Apple II Plus and basically just adding a different badge to it. But with the Apple IIc, the new machine, they hired a design agency and they came up with a new design language that they called Snow White. And you can see that it has a radically different design from the original Apple II. You have a much smaller case for the machine, and then you have a monitor which has a stand so you can actually sort of set it up as a kind of console. On top of this, the machine had a carry handle at the back, which meant you could prop it up and use it in a slightly more ergonomic way. Anyway, this video isn't about the Apple IIc, but what was interesting as well was at the same time, they released a new drive, not actually branded as a Disk II drive, it's branded as an Apple IIc drive. And for the first time, it came with a 19-pin D-sub connector, and that meant you didn't have the problems with the card. That was obviously moot because this particular machine couldn't actually support any cards whatsoever. So what Apple did was they built in many of the desired features directly into the Apple IIc. So for example, there is a disk controller built into the machine, and that means you can actually take the drive that you can see here and plug it directly in. So that's quite interesting because this would lead to an update for the rest of the Apple II line, as we'll see in a second. So we're still in 1984. Just a short while later, Apple revealed that the Apple engineers had been busy on another disk drive for the Apple II series, and this time it's specifically for the Apple IIe, and it was called the DuoDisk, and you can see why. It's actually a completely new styling of the Disk II technology, but this time in a dual drive format. Now, this drive took on the same design philosophy as had been seen in the Disk IIc, and that meant that it had a 19-pin D-sub connector, which was a big improvement over the 20-pin connector on the Disk II drive, which is prone to be inserted backwards, which will then damage your drive. So to use this particular drive with your Apple II, you need a special controller card. So as you can see underneath, we have the I/O controller card, which has the cable, a ribbon cable that comes out of the back of your Apple II and allows you to attach this unit. I must admit, when I first saw this design, I was very charmed by it, and I actually did buy one of these. It turned out to be problematic and it had a failure. And then I bought a second one and that also has a failure as well. In my future, I can see that I'm going to have a bit of a session where I repair 2 of these units. But they really are fantastic and I'm looking forward to getting those working. But internally, they're basically Disk II drives. There may be small modifications obviously to them. After all, 6 years has gone by since the initial drive's release. So I would imagine Shurgard and other drive manufacturers haven't stood still in that time. But basically, it's a Disk II drive, works with ProDOS, works with Apple DOS, but basically you get 2 drives in one unit. About a year later, after the DuoDisk, Apple actually then released a single drive version of that drive, very similar design language. Obviously, there must have been customers out there who didn't need 2 drives at the same time, so Apple decided that they would serve that community, and these are very, very common these days. I'm assuming that many schools bought these drives, and because of this, these are actually quite affordable on the marketplace. Very reliable drives. I find these pretty much always work if you buy one, so these are very much recommended. Apple had to release an update to the controller card. Well, I'm not sure they had to do that, but they did release an update to the controller card. It's basically the same as the I/O controller card. The 2 are interchangeable, but they changed the product name to the Apple 525 Drive controller. But the actual product itself is called a UniDisk 5¼ inch. And this is because there was a new drive about to hit the market pretty soon, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So just a few months later, in September of 1985, Apple released the UniDisk 3.5. And yeah, you can see now why they call the other drive the 5.25, just to differentiate the two. Obviously, they are physically different. The 3.5 drive supports the new higher density disks, 3.5-inch disks, and that would have given you 800K on each disk, so a massive upgrade over the original drive. Actually turns out to be not that popular a drive. You need a card to go with it. And the reason for that is, originally the Disk 2 drives, they actually used the processor in the Apple II itself to actually transfer the data. Many drives in the era, they would have a processor actually built into the drive. For instance, the Commodore 1541 drive famously has a 6502 processor in it. And that's because data doesn't move itself. There has to be a processor that actually transports the data back and forth. But Steve Wozniak had the very clever idea of using the actual CPU in the Apple II to save on money. But by the time it gets to the UniDisk 3.5, that isn't going to work anymore. It isn't actually fast enough to transfer the data. So the UniDisk 3.5 has its own processor built into it. And for that, you need a special card which you can keep up with the data rate and so on and so forth. Like I said, a very rare card these days. And the reason why is because this drive didn't really catch on, because you've got the usual problem, which is that everybody has a 5.25-inch drive. And most of the software would have come out on 5.25-inch disks. Well, I would say pretty much all the software. You may have got some software coming out on 3.5-inch disks as well, but the vast majority of software still would have been distributed on 5.25-inch disks. And that meant that those drives were still required to use an Apple II. However, you could get one of these drives and then rock 800K per disk, which would have been very useful if you couldn't actually afford a hard disk solution. So now we're in 1986, September 1986, a year later again, and it's the launch of the Apple IIgs, a machine that unfortunately didn't soar to the heights that it should have. It was hampered by a rather slow CPU. It was a 16-bit CPU, but there were problems with this design. And people also rumor that Apple purposely hobbled the CPU so that it would be slower than it needed to be, so that it wouldn't compete with the Apple Macintoshes. I'm not certain of that. I think, in fact, it was more to do with basically the development of the CPU. It just came out being not as reliable as they envisaged in the first place. Along with this machine, there was a new 3.5-inch drive, but confusingly, it isn't the UniDisk 3.5. This is actually branded as the Apple 3.5-inch drive. I'm not sure why they branded it like that. You would have thought that as it was standard with the Apple IIgs, they would have called it the Apple IIgs drive, just as they had the Apple IIc drive. But I guess it can be used on Apple IIs as well. This particular drive doesn't need a card to work on the IIgs because it has a disk port built in, and it has the CPU power to actually transfer the data off this drive easily. Physically very, very similar to the UniDisk 3.5, and that's why I've given you the product codes there. Now we're sliding into 1987, and in January of 1987, a refresh of the Apple II range was released in close to the original form factor, although in this case we now have a numeric keypad built into the machine. The Franklin Ace that I mentioned earlier, that actually came with a numeric keypad, and there were many customers of the Apple II that wanted to have that as a standard feature. So the Apple IIe Platinum release actually did give you that feature, and there was a slight change to the case, plus other changes as well. But for our focus on drives, they actually released a new version of the UniDisk drive. Apart from a color change, it was basically identical to the original drive. The Platinum, as you can probably tell by its name, has a slightly different color to the original Apple II range. It's more of a kind of grayish white color, and they carried across that design language into the updated drive. These are also extremely common, again, because they're later in Apple's life, so embedded very, very strongly in schools at this point. If you're buying on eBay, you may find that you get the 104 drives or the 107 drives. They're both extremely common, both very good drives to get a hold of. And then we have to jump almost 2 years into the future to reach the end of our story. This is the last physical machine that Apple released, if you discount the Apple IIe card, which we looked at in another video. I'll link to that here. This is the Apple IIc Plus. It has a faster processor, it has a 3.5-inch drive built in, and it can, of course, use the earlier drives that we've seen. It's very rare these days to actually find this machine, because by this point we're getting to the end of the 1980s. This is a number of years after the Amiga came out and the ST, and the PC by this point was going great guns as well, increasing in power all the time. So it became harder and harder for a fundamentally 8-bit machine to compete against those machines. But Apple decided to produce a refresh of the platform, and so there is actually a second model of Apple IIc out there. Quite well sought after because they have a faster CPU, and yeah, it's an attractive design as well, using the sort of platinum color scheme. So thank you for sticking with me through that entire timeline there. What was it? Something like 12 years, going from 1977 when the machine came out with a tape drive, and would have been a little bit annoying to use, but still quite exciting for people to have microcomputers back in those early days. But then very quickly you've got the Disk II system that was released for it, and then things really took off. What I found surprising when I was doing the research for this video was actually how early on in the life of the Apple II hard drives were actually available. So it's very interesting to see the Corvus 11A drive there. And as I said earlier in the video, there were a number of other solutions, hard disk solutions, that actually became available for the Apple II. But I didn't really think it was necessary to go into each and every single one of those in this particular video, especially when there were many other things that we could look at in the lifetime of the Apple II. There is actually one device that I didn't actually go into, and I've got to thank Ron's Computer Videos for that. I was chatting to Ron, asking him if he could have a look over my timeline and make sure there weren't any sort of major mistakes in there. And he did mention that there was one more drive, which was called the SuperDrive. And that was a 3.5-inch drive that came out actually in the 1990s. I did a little bit of research into it, and I think it was on the market somewhere around, I think, 1992, something like that. And I did think about changing the timeline for this video and actually putting that right at the end. But it's a little bit like the planet Pluto. When you do like a sort of chart of the solar system, most of the planets are pretty close to the sun, and then all of a sudden you've got Pluto way out there. And it turns out the SuperDrive was a little bit like that in my chart. It just made the chart look extremely long. And there was another reason as well why I didn't include it, which is that the SuperDrive was actually released, as far as I know, only officially for the Macintosh computers. But some enterprising people out there actually worked out that if you actually connected it to a 2GS using a special card, which they produced, then it would actually work on the 2GS. The 2GS had the horsepower to actually be able to interact with it in the way that you would want to. So yeah, interesting that there actually was one more drive in the great lineage of all the different drives that were available for the Apple II. It's an incredible span of time that the Apple II covered, going all the way from 1977, when you've got 5.25-inch drives and relatively small hard disks in terms of capacity, but absolutely massive in terms of their physical size. The Corvus actually shocked me how big it was. But if you watched any videos on mini computing, you'll know that you get hard disks which are absolutely massive, like an old sort of suitcase in size, and would have been physically very difficult to carry. Something like sometimes 20 to 30 kilos per hard drive, which is kind of crazy. So you get those being introduced in 1979. The Corvus, relatively small compared to a suitcase, but still, as we saw earlier, a really big drive. And then later on in the life, we get 3.5-inch floppy drives coming along, 800K. They weren't, they didn't really take off on the Apple IIe 2 Plus because so much software already came out on the 5.25-inch drives, and the machine didn't really need it as much as, let's say, the 2GS. But of course, the 2GS was a faster machine, more akin to something like an Amiga or an ST or something like that, and that really did make use of the 3.5-inch drives, and that was a big success on that particular platform. So anyway, I hope all of this was useful to you. I know it was definitely useful to me to do all this research and find out about all these different devices and cards. Keep an eye out in the diagrams that I showed earlier for the individual product numbers. That could be useful when you're actually trying to buy one of these things on eBay. Some of the cards look very, very similar to each other, and if you type in the names of them, they're similar enough that you'll actually be shown different cards. So if I were you, if you want to buy any of these devices or the cards that I showed, then I would basically put in the product numbers, and you're much more likely to actually get the real thing and not be disappointed when it turns up and it's actually the wrong device. Anyway, I think this video has gone on long enough. So hopefully you liked it. And if you did, please click on the like button. And if you're coming here for the first time and you're not subscribed in particular, please make sure you hit subscribe and also click on the bell there so that you get notified about the next videos in this series. As I said, we will have videos on the Disk 2 and also on the UniDisk, which you can see here, the UniDisk 5.25. And also we're going to look into hard drive solutions as well. So I think with those 4 videos all together, we're going to have a pretty good overview of disk solutions on the Apple II. Well, in this case, we're focusing mainly on the Apple IIe. But you've got an overview now of what happened on the Apple IIc, Apple IIgs, etc., etc. And I hope that stands you in good stead. Anyway, hope to see you in the next video. But until then, take care and goodbye.